Hello and a warm welcome to the first episode of Let's Talk Human Rights, the vodcast. Join me, your host, Masechaba Masemola waMdaka, on this series titled The Past for the Future, a lens on reparative justice in Africa. Through this platform, we will interface history with our world as we know it today, speaking to intergenerational learning, understanding and having important dialogue and courageous conversations that requires collective attention about reparative justice as a vital element of human rights, economic prosperity, and redress for affected peoples. This year's 2025 African Union AU's theme is Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations. Now, this theme focuses on addressing historical injustices like the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and apartheid through reparations and racial healing. The scope of this conversation goes beyond historical injustices and into the current fabric of societies around the world. More importantly, how it will impact the trajectory of country relations between one another and chart a pathway for real reconciliation. No proper reconciliation can take place when people still feel aggrieved. Now, the case of South Africa's land restitution process has in recent months come under the spotlight, many citing how it's misunderstood and weaponized to suit political posturing. In an article published by Joanna Batsera at Rhodes University in South Africa, she states that land redistribution and people's access to land have always been high on the political agenda in South Africa. Colonialization and dispossession have been a long and strong feature of the country's history, even more so during apartheid, when land ownership became firmly concentrated in the hands of the white minority. With the first democratic elections of 1994, two key pieces of legislation were developed to address these. They were the 1994 Restitution Land Rights Act and the 1997 Land Reform White Paper. Together, they provided a framework that had three main aims, which were land restitution, making it possible for people who were evicted from their land to get it back. The second being land redistribution, to address the racial inequality in the land ownership process. And finally, redress. What is the broader context of understanding the validity of seeking reparative justice, which is a global and obligatory requirement, and who has the right to be legally and financially accountable after all these years? To help me speak to these matters, I am very pleased to be joined by my two guests who will help us navigate the complexities and emphasize the importance of this timely discussion, reflection, clarity, courage, and strategic reframing of the reparations discourse. Makmid Kamara is a Sierra Leonean human rights leader, reparatory justice advocate, with experience spanning over 20 years working with national and international development, human rights in Africa and the United Kingdom. He is the founder of Reform Initiatives, an organization dedicated to harvesting the dividends of democracy through reparatory justice and contributing to reforming broken systems and structures. Yasmin Sooka is a leading human rights lawyer. She is currently the executive director of the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa. Yasmin served on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 1996 to 2001 and chaired the committee responsible for the final report from 2001 to 2003. She was appointed by the United Nations to serve on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Sierra Leone from 2002 to 2004. Since 2000, she has also been a member of the advisory body on the review of the United Nations Resolution 1325. Yasmin and Makmid, thank you so much for being here with me to unpack, as I said, this very complex issue of reparative justice and what it means in our time today. Makmid, I think I'll start with you. As an expert in the field of reparative justice, the legal framework and the mechanisms around the architecture of realizing redress, can you take us through the main elements of necessitating reparative justice?
Thank you very much, Chaba, and thank you for having us today on the inaugural edition of the podcast. I'm quite pleased to be here and equally importantly to talk about this issue, which is gaining global momentum And especially at this time when the African Union has unanimously decided to declare a whole year as the theme of the year, focusing on reparations. Now, the reparative justice debates and demands are not new. They've been going on, and the demands have been made for several years. We will argue that it's a century of journey to achieve reparative justice for historical crimes. It is important to note that the demands for reparative justice are specific to the enslavement of Black people, colonialism and the crimes that were committed during the colonial era, and apartheid, of course, as you've mentioned. But in the recent debates, it's expanding to include neo-colonialism, to include climate injustice, and some of the damages that have been done to our environment. Now, what are the mechanisms, you ask? What are the mechanisms that people are demanding for? What are the aspirations? Why is it that we are making these demands, and some will argue, hundreds of years after these crimes were committed? And this is simple. The answer to this is that the crimes that were committed several hundreds years ago, the consequences of those crimes continue to live with us today. Yeah. The structures, the global structures that we continue to live with are the consequences of the decisions that were made by people who profited from the trade of Black people, the enslavement of Black people, from colonialism, from the exploitation and subjugation of Africans and people of African descent. So, and those crimes were never remedied. The impact of those crimes continue to live with us in various forms and shapes. So what we're asking for in the first place is for global equity. Now, the demand for reparations is anchored on two things: global equity and human dignity. On the issue of global equity, we see how some of the structures that have been established, whether it's the UN, whether it's the World Trade Organization, whether it's all of these, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, where power resides. And this was because, especially for the UN, for instance, when it was formed, those who were the decision makers were all the colonizers and not the colonial. Most of the African countries were actually exactly. There were nobody there to represent the aspirations and interests of Africans. So that has to change. So to ensure that we were not just there as tokenistic participants of the processes that have been carried out in these sections, we're actually there as active decision makers. So equity at the international level, but also equity around race and racial elements. Some of the things that we experience, whether it's basic things like visa inequality, it's not something that is happening today. It's not the policy that actually came from government now. It's as a result of the historical connections to race, racialism, colorism, and the mindsets and the myths that have been impacted and or transferred to people. So that's the one element. But just as a summary on the issue of equity here can take different forms. And I'm happy to unpack some of those issues, but I want to move on to the issue of human dignity, which is the second element that we're talking about when we asking for reparative justice. It all comes to the fact that what we're talking about humans here. We're not talking about figures. We're not talking about stats. We're not talking about objects. Human beings were dehumanized. We're objectified. We're transformed into commodities. That's a reform of the mind has to happen. An acknowledgement that these were crimes that were committed has to happen. An apology to those who were the victims of those crimes has to happen. And of course, a redress, some kind of compensation, whether it's financial or other forms, has to happen. Healing between and among the recipient of these crimes has to happen. So a number of things has to happen, and we're looking at reparative justice from the right to remedy framework, which is a universally recognized right? And we're looking at the full spectrum of the right to remedy, from acknowledgement to apology to compensation to the guarantees of non-repetition to satisfaction. So we're not just talking about financial compensation, which is what normally comes up when people hear about reparative justice. Yeah. And the mechanisms for these can take different forms. It can take legal, it can take financial, it can take developmental, it can take racial, it can take cultural and educational, to summarize. Thank you.
And on that note, Makmid, and I think I would like our viewers and our listeners to also note that the pursuit of reparative justice is enshrined in the United Nations Resolution 16147 through the basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparations for victims of gross violations and international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. So, Makmid, on that note, you speak about global equity and human dignity. Why then, if the mechanisms exist, is it seemingly difficult to see this process through? Especially, as I said, because the legal framework is there and the mechanisms are there. And of course, in another conversation you and I had, you noted that, of course, declarations and protocols, frankly, are non-binding. So maybe we can speak to that a bit.
Yes. You're absolutely right. Some of the declarations, some of the policies these are soft laws. They are just there to guide. But we also have international human rights law, international law that actually should be used and has been used in a number of cases to provide remedy for those for crimes that have been committed, and especially for victims or survivors of those crimes. But one thing that is lacking in international law is equity. There's no equity in international law. We have seen how the imbalance or in the interpretation of international law. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but the lawyers will tell you that the structures and the way the system is framed is imbalanced, is not favorable to the global majority. And the global majority were the recipients of some of these historical crimes. But the mechanisms that have been put in place, which have not been used, and going back to your question as to why, the question of why is that people will lose, the fear of losing power, the fear of losing what they've been enjoying over centuries, the fear of losing a status quo that was created for them by them and not for the rest of us. And that is the fear. There's also a deliberate ignorance, a deliberate refusal to understand the importance that when you give equity, it is actually for the benefits of humanity. And when you respect other person's human dignity, you are, in a way, acknowledging your own dignity as a human being. But there's a combination of factors. Fear of losing the hold and control of what currently exists, ignorance, refusal, deliberate refusal to engage in the issue, a lack of political interest and will, and just the basic lack of humanity in some cases. People are happy to talk about their victory in world wars, but they're not happy to talk about the crimes that they committed during slavery.
Yeah, and I think as we talk about legal ramifications, moving beyond the rhetoric of acknowledgement, accountability, and redress being necessary, why it is no longer enough just to be apologetic. Christina Duarte, the Special Advisor on Africa to the UN Secretary General, states that the 21st century demands a bold redefinition of what reparations truly mean. Reparations must not merely be seen as a financial compensation for past events. They must be understood as a call to transform the very rules of the game. And this is something that Makmid, you touched on. Such as international trade, finance, and governance systems that have perpetuated injustice for centuries. Now, Yasmin, how far did the Truth and Reconciliation process of South Africa adequately address land restitution as a form of reparative justice relative to what we see as life today? Why is the land issue such a contentious one? Because it's definitely one of being very racially divisive and potentially has, it could potentially have spillover into ethnic tensions.
Thank you, Masechaba, for inviting me to participate in this vlog today. I think it's really important to look at the history of South Africa. You know, South Africa has had more than 300 years of colonialism and apartheid, which was legalized in 1948. But if you go back in our history, by 1913, 93% of the land was dispossessed from black owners. And in fact, as Sol Plaatje, a very famous South African, put it, on the 20th of June 1913, black South Africans woke up to find that while they weren't slaves anymore, they didn't own land. And in fact, they became pariahs in their own land, and people were moved off their land. And so you fast forward, in fact, to the negotiated settlement and the transition in South Africa. And it's quite shocking when you think about, while there were trade-offs that we accepted to actually move into a peaceful transition, I think one of the major compromises was the fact that there was not going to be the nationalization of land, which was a key demand in the Freedom Charter, and of course a key demand by the liberation movements. And so I think it's quite perplexing when you think of the fact that that was such a big compromise to allow us to go to elections. So then on the 27th of April in 1994, you have 85% of our population accepting these compromises and going to the election. You have the ANC winning with an overwhelming majority. And at the same time, there's this enormous celebration because you have Nelson Mandela, who's come out of jail, lead us. But what he inherited was a country in which the economy was totally in the hands of white people. And in fact, when you look at the racialized nature of the land question, the economic question in our country, I don't think he anticipated that these are the challenges that South
would
Africa...
come in later years,
yeah.
Indeed, yeah.
And so you have the Truth Commission that is set up as this mechanism to deal with the other compromise, which was to give up the idea of accountability, criminal accountability for the crimes of the past. But at the same time, you have this notion of how the Truth Commission is tied to a restorative justice model based on the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is really about the recognition of human dignity and the restoration, I would argue, for equity and balance. And the Truth Commission's mandate actually was heavily focused on civil and political rights violations, but it didn't really deal with what I would call the structural underpinnings of apartheid, one of which was the land question, the other was the economic one, the question of education, the question of the way in which you had black people deprived of any access to any form of social services. In fact, there was a famous apartheid president who said that black people should only be trained to be the hewers of wood and the carriers of water. And so you can imagine what that legacy is left for South Africa today. At the same time, when the Truth Commission was set up, you had the Land Commission, which was one of the mechanisms under that land transformation model that was set up. But of course, the Land Commission didn't work in a way that it should have. But the Truth Commission then acknowledges that, in fact, the question of land is indelibly tied to the question of apartheid and oppression, and that this is something that the government of South Africa would need to do. And so there's that recognition of that. But this is a structural question, which I think has dominated South Africa since before colonialism and apartheid. And in 1994, when you look at the fact that even then, 85% of the land was held by 5% of the people, and the black population had access to very little arable land. And so in that context, I would argue that, the remedy should be the question of restitution. The question of compensation is just not enough unless you accompany that with measures which deal with the structural questions. And then, of course, an acknowledgement and a consciousness of the benefit you have when you own land, because that's something that white South Africans in our country refuse to acknowledge. And it is a challenge that we are sitting with today, that there is no consciousness of the fact, when we talk about wealth, where do you get your wealth from? You get your wealth from the fact that you are able to use a particular piece of land. But if you're thrown off that land, You have no means of production. You have nothing in modern day where you can take to the bank and say, can I use this as collateral or equity to get any loans? And so even your own development in modern transformed South Africa is hampered by this legacy of inequality that continues to persist in South Africa today.
Yasmin, I actually want to stay on that point. Speaking to disposition of land, and when you look at the dynamics of the ratios and how it worked in terms of percentages, in the case of South Africa's land restitution, through the Restitution Act of 1994, which opened the land claims process, which you were talking about in 95, how weighted is the argument on private property rights in light of historical land claims? This is especially the case in reference to generational wealth, which is something that we like to speak of almost as a status symbol. How should we perceive generational wealth on the basis of acquired wealth through ill-gotten means?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, property rights in South Africa are protected in the Constitution. And even Section 25 of the Constitution, which is really meant to promote transformation, particularly land transformation, it speaks to the question of willing seller, willing buyer. And in those early years, when you look at the government's restitution policy, particularly which involved communities that had been taken off ancestral land, in fact, it became almost near impossible for the land restitution process because the government had to buy land back. And once, those who were sitting on the land, the settler population understood that this was going to be dependent on them, you can imagine that, in fact, the prices for land went up. And in one instance, I think it was around the Maluleke community,
which is where, just for the
it's in the Limpopo area, and it's near the Kruger. It's in that environment of the Kruger National Park, and in fact, the government wanted to buy the land back, and the price went up to something like 90 million, and it was almost the budget, really, of the land claims process at that point. And so, while there was political will at that moment, there was also the resistance from those who were sitting on the land to actually passing that over. And so when we talk about generational wealth, the other problem is, of course, that, people didn't have title deeds to land. And so, even today, this remains a challenge for most people, particularly people who would regard themselves as being Black. And so when we talk about this, generational wealth question, obviously that 5% who own so much of South Africa, when you go, in fact, if you go to the estate office, there was a study that was done last year, and they found that when you looked at the kind of wealth that was transferred from one group to another, one generation, I would say, you're looking at 45% in the case of white people, 23% in the case of what would be regarded as Asian people of Asian origin, 9% of people who are designated colored, and 3% Black. So in that context, what do we talk about when we talk about generational wealth? And this is really the crux of the matter because, I think there was a World Bank study a few years ago which looked at the question of how many generations it takes to move from poverty into what one would consider to be the low rung of the middle class. In the case of the Scandinavian countries, it takes something like 3 generations. And you can see the evidence of that when you look at the migration patterns that have taken place in Europe. But when it comes to a country like South Africa, at that point in 2019, when the study was done, it took 9 generations. I would argue that in 2025, where inequality in our country has increased, it would take you 13 generations to get to that point. And that is why I think you see this, dissatisfaction around the country, because in the 30 years since the transition has taken place, you have to ask our government questions. Why did you not pursue the question of a proper land process, give it much more urgency? And why the urge now when you pass the expropriation law, knowing that all you're doing is really a repetition of laws that exist already. And so there's this question of political will, which I think now is at the center, I think, of the debate in South Africa. And I think, as Makmid pointed out, people don't want to give back what they stole. But more than that, the next generation doesn't want to acknowledge that the benefit they enjoyed arises from what was stolen. And that, for me, is one of the, I would say, critiques of the work of the Truth Commission, that we didn't point out sufficiently the question of benefit and the wealth of the beneficiaries. And that is why the beneficiaries of South Africa don't want to acknowledge their benefit. The fact that you can have this question now, that there's persecution of white people and that we want to take away their land. Do you know, nobody in South Africa has had their land taken away from them. And any land process would require that if there's a dispute, it would have to go to the courts. So there's no way of saying, oh, we're going to come there one day and settle them ourselves there, even though the EFF, a political party, has called for that. That hasn't happened in South Africa. And so this is going to require, I think, both sides. And this is what a restorative justice process is about. It's not just about the people who are the victims. It is about dealing with the underlying structural issues. And that requires that those who were the beneficiaries, the perpetrators, the settlers and those who benefited from apartheid, they actually need to consider that it is time to give. And that's the question. It's a moral question and a legal one, because there's an obligation in law. The basic rights and remedies which you raised, in 2005, that resolution was adopted unanimously in the General Assembly. So that is what we call soft law, but it is what nation states and what citizens can hold up to their governments, that this is a legal obligation. So it's a question of morality. It's a question of accountability as well. And I think that's the way the debate should be, accountability.
Yeah, I think you've raised some very important points, which, Yasmin, which lead us to the next point, around the three core components of encounter, repair, and transform in the context of restorative justice in this case. Just by way of definition, encounter involving bringing together all parties who have been involved in a conflict or wrongdoing, including the offender and the victim, and potentially others who have been impacted, and you highlighted this. Repair, focusing on addressing the harm caused by the wrongdoing, often through restitution, apologies, or other forms of making amends. And transform, being aiming to change the attitudes and behaviors of those involved in fostering the understanding and accountability with a greater sense of responsibility. In the broader spin, speaking to a comparative experience to South Africa, where would you say we've acquired interventions in another African country, Makmid, in this process, specifically on the issue of land restitution? And Yasmin, then, I mean, you've painted quite a bleak picture of what this looks like in the context of South Africa, but I'd like you to also answer that question. But I'll start with you, Makmid, in terms of a comparative example where the process around land restitution has sort of taken off, or to somewhat being successful, if I may even say that.
Yes, thanks. The question of successful land restitution program is out for the jury. I don't have any reference of a particular country in the continent that successfully implemented a land restitution program, and this is as a result of a number of factors. Now, when we talk about reparative justice, there's a framing that we use as well. It's a 5R framing. The first one is reconnection. The second one is repair. And among these five, I don't want to go into the list of them, but there's resistance in this 5 framing. Resistance from those who feel that they're losing whatever affluence, influence, or wealth or status that they had, who will push back, who will resist the change, and that that has been impacted or influenced by the repair process. And there's also the resistance on the other side, where we've achieved some kind of reform and transformation, and people are pushing back. We have to resist that backlash and that push. And this is what we have seen. We're seeing now in a number of countries. But just to go to your question on examples, we've had Zimbabwe, just a neighbor to South Africa, that is undertaking land restitution under the late President Robert Mugabe. And we saw what happened after the land restitution program in Zimbabwe. Kenya has taken similar measures. Gambia recently, after Jammeh was removed from power, undertook a number of land restitution. And again, we are witnessing a very unfortunate development as well there in terms of who gets the land that was taken or confiscated by Jammeh and now taken by the government, and how it's been redistributed. So the challenge in the continent is that, as Yasmin mentioned, there's a question of political will and interests. There's a question of other interests that will influence that political will and interest. And in my view, it's most times the corporate interest that overshadows the people's interests. So when this happens, when these interests clash, the one that takes precedence and the one that takes hold is almost always the corporate interest. And then by corporate, I'm talking about multinational corporations that are not housed or based or hosted in the continent, but come from external to extract. So it's a continuation of the mentality or the project of extractivism. Africa has always been a place for extraction. During the slave trade, our people were extracted. And during that period, material resources, natural resources were also extracted. That continues up to this day. So what a friend of mine had considered as the black cargo. So whether it's oil, whether it's gold, whether it's diamond, whether it's bauxite, all of these come from the continent and have been extracted. And the extraction is almost always violent. And this is why when we're talking about restitution here and redistribution of land that has been stolen, that has been taken or confiscated by those with power, we have to think about the fact that those who are on the verge of losing will fight back, will push back. There's always a backlash because they don't want to lose. They know the value associated. If you take a land from person, that's the humanity you've taken. People's lands are connected to their humanity. In Africa, we are who we are based on where we live and how we connect to our land. So that's why in our case, for instance, a reform initiative, when I mentioned reconnection, it is not just reconnecting people who have been separated from the continent, it's also reconnecting people with their land and environment. And this is where the issue of restitution is crucial, because you are bringing people whose lands have been stolen, who have been separated and exiled from their land, taken away from their land with no recourse to justice. And we still see indigenous communities in different parts of the continent who have gotten no recognition of their identity. Their land continue to be stolen by the government that is ought to protect them and protect the land. And there's no system. There's no system for them to get recompense. There's no system for them to regain what they've lost. And the repair we're talking about here, especially when it comes to restitution, it is about returning it back to the original place, original holders of that. It's not just about apologizing. It's not just about giving them money for what they have for the land that they've lost, because you can never, in a number of places, you can never quantify monetarily the loss that people experience from the loss of their land. It can never be monetized. So the restitution has to go, it has to be deep, it has to be systemic, it has to be meaningful and long term. And this leads to your point about transformation. The call and the campaigns for reparative justice is not just about looking back. It is looking back for the future. And so I'm actually happy with your points around the title of this podcast. We're taking the Sankofa approach. The Sankofa approach is an Adinkra symbol and sign from Ghana, from the Akan people, where the bird looks back to collect an egg so that it can move forward. And within Africa, there's so many proverbs and so many cultures where for you to move forward, you have to look back. For you to ensure that you're taking the right path, you have to look where you've been and the path that you've used before, so ensure that whatever mistakes that were made in the past, you correct them. Reparative justice is not just a reflection or recollection of the crimes that were committed, or for us making a claim for those crimes. It is about transforming the future of Africans and people of African descent, transforming the world to ensure that it is a space that promotes and advances equity and human dignity. It is futuristic. It is not just retrospective.
Yeah, I think I'm going to use this opportunity just to tee on from what Makmid said, Yasmin. Talking to benefactors and beneficiaries and who custodians are in this process, it is reported that the South African government, it's alleged that the South African government is the third biggest owner of land. And if it is a question of land redistribution, why not focus on what has already been acquired? Also, government would be the main guarantor or custodian of the process. And at the moment, one would argue there's gross mistrust between government and its citizens. Ultimately, who decides how claims are processed and conducted, and who is eligible?
Well, in the South African context, and I want to pick up on a point that Makmid raised, which is that, we don't look at the past to build a better past, but we really look at the past because we want to avoid the question of recurrence. And so I would argue that when we talk about reparative justice, we're also talking about transformation and transformative justice. And when you look at the role that the government played in that period just after 1994, one element of the three-pronged approach to dealing with land was restitution. But the other was also protecting what I would call tenure rights. Because, in our country, of course, following the taking of land by settlers, you had most Black people actually living on land as workers. And so the government passed a law to protect their rights, their tenure rights. And we did a survey, I think in 2008, in which we showed that, in fact, these tenure rights protection was in fact so misused by farmers that more than 1 million people were taken off the land in just 1 year in order to ensure that those people would not have any rights to claim land. And where it became really horrifying was the fact that people have their burial sites on these farms, and then suddenly a whole family or a whole community are moved off. And so that ancestral tie is broken. And unfortunately, when you look at the cases around the country, our legal system has not been able to protect them. And so when you ask this question, who makes that determination? South Africa had a land commission that was set up at the same time when the Truth Commission was set up. But it was so bureaucratic and inefficient. So many times they lost the claims of people that when you actually go back and you look at whether or not these land claims have actually been dealt with, actually you don't really find that they've been dealt with sufficiently. And so you see at that point in the 1990s the willingness to execute, but at the same time you see the inability to actually take it to a final point. And particularly when you look at the question of urban land claims, most of them have not been settled in the country. South Africa also has a rural population that has been on the move because of the fact that people are landless. And so most people flock to urban areas. And the question of urbanization is also an issue that the government could have dealt with a long time ago, which is to say, okay, if you're a young person and you don't want your land back in a rural area, why don't we exchange that and give you something in an urban area? And that discussion never took place. And so, there's this question of also people's notions of what restitution means for them has to also deal with the reality in which they live. And in fact, young people in South Africa, particularly black young people, can't afford to buy property in our country because it has just been completely eroded by the way in which the marketplace has worked. The other question is, of course, when you look at South Africa and you look at the way in which corporates behaved, you look at the fact that South Africa was a place where mineral rights were in fact exploited. But in the 1990 transition period, the government, I think, made a whole range of mistakes. And they allowed many of these countries who had really built their wealth on mineral wealth to actually go and list on the London Stock Exchange. And with that, of course, you had the moving of most of their viable assets out of the country. And what they have left in their wake is really, I think, quite a lot of devastation. The government also allowed, a company like ArcelorMittal to take over ISCO, which was really a functioning entity under the apartheid government. And today, there's a discussion about whether the government is going to bail out the company that bought ISCO over. And so you see this perennial litany of mistakes dealing with corporations, which I think is quite an untouched area, not just in South Africa, but in the region. And of course, Africa is a place where extractivism, whether it's coltan from the Congo, whether it's diamonds and all of the mineral wealth that they need for cell phones and for technical manufacturing in the global first world, I think that is something that we need to rethink how we are going to engage on that area. Are there good stories? I mean, there was one story that I heard where, there was a man who had left South Africa during the years of apartheid. And when the transition happened, he came back. He inherited a farm from his parents in a very wealthy area, the wealthiest municipality in the country, Stellenbosch. And he took over this farm. He found the farm with a number of workers already there. And then at some point, they were doing some building on the farm, and they began to dig, and they found skeletal remains. And so he called in UCT's anthropology department. They also came to exhume the skeletal remains, and they then started to do DNA testing. And UCT said, well, we have to look at whether or not there's a connection between the skeletal remains that we found and the workers who were on the farm. And they began to match the DNA of the remains and the workers who had been working there. And they tracked back that, in fact, probably 2 generations ago, in fact, the workers had been the ones who owned the farm. And this became a project at UCT to uncover this historical truth. But this farmer was confronted with the fact that now he'd inherited wealth that didn't really belong to him. Actually, it belonged to the people who were working on the farm. And then the question became, what was he going to do? He then decided that he was not going to return the farm, but that he would buy an adjacent one, and that he would make that available to the workers on the farm, and they could find a way of working on both their farm and this farm that he owned. And when the story was being told, and it was told as, a wonderful story of reparations and reconciliation, and I asked the question, why were you unable to make the decision to give the farm back to those who owned it? And he was silent for a long time, and then he said, I didn't want to. My parents had worked on it. I said, it's not your parents may have owned it, but the people who worked on it are the employees. And why didn't you buy yourself a new farm? And there were lots of people in the audience who said, why are you spoiling the story? But it gives you an example of the unwillingness to acknowledge that you may have received in a way that is unjust. And it's not just about undoing that injustice, but there also has to be a conscious acknowledgement from yourself that an injustice was done. And I think when you look at South Africa and many countries which have had settler population, that willingness to acknowledge the injustice is so much a part of the trajectory of the need for transformation in our countries.
I think staying on that point, Yasmin, in the discussions that we're having today and when we started talking about the South African case and South Africa being thrust into the spotlight around the issue of land expropriation without compensation, can you please give us some insight into land expropriation versus land reform and what is the difference and how it relates to land restitution?
I would say that, expropriation is really about deciding on a piece of land that for some or other reason you think is not being used. And that's a huge question in South Africa, where there are a lot of people who own properties which are lying fallow. There's a lot of arable land. But in fact, there's a need, if we're talking about real transfer of land, that you'd want to look at that and to look at whether that could be made available to other people. But when you're talking about land reform, I would argue that land reform is meant to be, a policy of transformation, an instrument. And you see that, when you look at land reform processes in many countries, they're done for different reasons. Like you look at countries like Japan and Korea, where the transformation was to, take land that belonged to the elite and in fact to transfer that to people who were supposedly right at the bottom. But in the end, those processes didn't work because they really began to enrich the same elites again. And in fact, you had more of a capitalist society than you had one that was egalitarian, which was what the objective of the land reform policy was meant to be. In our case, the land reform was meant to be about transformation. But I think along the lines, it got stuck. And so for me, the difference is really the question, expropriation is a tool or a mechanism, but land reform is about transformation. And we have had enough, white papers and policy documents written about the transformation and what needs to be done. But the real question is about the tools that you use. And, when you look at the Appropriation Act, I think that there was really no need to do that. Because if you look at Section 25 of the Constitution, the power to expropriate was there, and the mechanisms to do it, in fact, were out there, but what you needed was political will. And I think that's where the lack really came from. The concrete ability to want to deal with the political questions of what expropriation would mean. And if you look at the current context, one of the real reasons you have this Expropriation Act is also because you begin to see the way in which political parties have emerged in South Africa. And the EFF, as a political party in 2018, introduced this debate on the need for an expropriation policy and an expropriation law. And it took from 2018 until 2025 to actually pass it. But this is just a tool. And that tool has to be accompanied with political will, with resources, because I think the resource question is going to become quite important. And that question you raised about the government being the biggest owner of land, that has to be tackled as well. But if you travel around South Africa and you look at all of these massive farms that exist, the one thing we have seen is a change in land usage. And ecotourism, private game farms are a huge thing in South Africa. Even the Kruger National Park is bordered completely with a whole lot of private farmers who are now breeding game on their farms. You can come from America and pay $10 million to shoot a lion. The other thing is the coupling of ecotourism with medical tourism. So people come here to do plastic surgery and they recuperate on these farms. And you have a lot of farms that have been turned into spas. And so suddenly this land is no longer available. And when you look at agriculture and its contribution to the GDP of South Africa, that has changed completely because during the years of apartheid, you had many structural tools to help white farmers. You had the land banks. You had policies which allowed people to find markets. They had a lot of support for the kind of technical implements they needed to do their farming. And in our country, some of that happened. But when you look at the corruption and the way that infected, the ability to support black farmers, I think that has been a really tragic trajectory. And you see that in the cases which are taking place in our courts now. The Estina dairy farm, for instance, is one of those examples. And so where there have been government interventions, that has also been marred by this question of corruption.
Absolutely.
And that is a challenge.
Yeah. I think on that note, we are going to take this debate to the streets, the word on the street. We interviewed two students, namely Rosalie and Julia, from Humboldt University in Berlin, on their perceptions of colonial history and how it shapes and influences history, looking against future relations between countries of the global north and the global south. Let's have a look.
Also aus der Schule weiß ich noch, dass Afrika aufgeteilt war zwischen den europäischen Kolonialmächten und dass mal so ein Handelsdreieck geherrscht hat zwischen Europa, Afrika und Amerika und von Afrika quasi die Sklaven nach Europa und Amerika geschafft wurden. Aber viel mehr ist dann leider auch nicht hängen geblieben, aber ich finde, man sollte eigentlich viel mehr über die Geschichte auch noch wissen und das sollte weiter geschult werden. Also ich finde, dass man nie alles gerecht gestalten kann. Es wird immer jemanden geben, der Ungerechtigkeit abkriegt, aber ich finde, man kann sich dafür einsetzen, dass es möglichst gerecht auf der Welt zugeht und dass man zum Beispiel Schäden, die früher mal gemacht wurden, ausgleicht, auch wenn man jetzt persönlich nicht mehr daran schuld ist. Und dass man zum Beispiel die afrikanische Kultur oder das Leben dort fördert und vielleicht auch den Austausch zwischen Europa und Afrika stärkt, da das ja zum Beispiel in Amerika schon so passiert oder mit Amerika passiert, aber zum Beispiel Austausch zu Afrika eher weniger ist als zu anderen Bereichen der Welt. Also für mich ist Eigentum körperliche Gegenstände und für mich ist spielt Eigentum eine sehr wichtige Rolle, weil darauf einfach die Wirtschaft basiert. Und ich finde, dass es auch in Afrika eine wichtige Rolle sein sollte, aber halt nicht negativ behaftet, sondern eher positiv und man daran was ändern sollte. Man sollte halt einfach dieses Ungleichgewicht im Eigentum wieder mehr ins Gleichgewicht bringen, aber trotzdem die wichtige Rolle des Eigentums beibehalten, da einfach darauf die Wirtschaft basiert und Eigentum ein sehr wichtiges Recht für jede Person ist. Also die geschichtliche Entwicklung hat einen sehr großen Einfluss auf die Gegenwart, da es ja auch die Gegenwart quasi bewirkt hat und aus der Geschichte viele Probleme kommen und Konflikte und die muss man halt in der Gegenwart lösen oder wir müssen zum Beispiel Afrika unterstützen bei den Problemen, die wir verursacht haben oder immer noch verursachen, zum Beispiel mit dem Klimawandel. Da müssen wir halt auf Afrika schauen, weil die bekommen die Folgen ja am schnellsten mit, die wir verursachen durch den Klimawandel und die haben einfach nicht so viel und die verursachen ja auch nicht so viel am Klimawandel, deswegen müssen wir die da unterstützen und quasi unsere Taten ausgleichen. Trotzdem sollten wir auf Augenhöhe kommunizieren. Okay. Die historischen Geschehnisse haben immer noch Auswirkungen auf heute, wie zum Beispiel der Dreieckshandel zwischen Amerika, Europa und Afrika wirkt sich noch auf heute aus, da Europa und Amerika immer noch die wirtschaftliche Überhand quasi über Afrika haben. Auch politisch hat Afrika nicht viel mitzureden, obwohl die deutlich mehr Einwohner haben als Europa, was eine Ungerechtigkeit ist, die man halt nicht weiter fördern sollte, indem man die weiter halt nicht einbezieht in die politischen Geschehnisse, da die ja auch die Folgen von unserer Politik quasi zu spüren bekommen. Und deshalb sollten die auch Mitspracherecht haben und auf jeden Fall auch gehört werden.
Das Eigentumsrecht erinnert mich sofort an den Artikel 14 Grundgesetz. Aus der deutschen Verfassung wird eben im Artikel 14 das Recht auf Eigentum legitimiert. Prinzipiell würde ich sagen, spielt das Eigentum, was gehört mir, was gehört dir, eine ganz zentrale, übergeordnete Rolle in der Gesellschaft hier in Deutschland. Es ist elementar wichtig für die Gesellschaft, wem etwas gehört. Und das prüfen wir natürlich auch in den Rechtswissenschaften permanent, auf wen jetzt der Anspruch übergegangen ist. Man könnte fast schon sagen, es strukturiert und organisiert auch sehr, sehr stark die Gesellschaft. Trotzdem würde ich auch sagen, dass das Eigentum ja eigentlich eher eine Art Konstrukt ist und eigentlich ja niemandem irgendwas wirklich gehört. Denn das ist ja eine Art Anspruch, der sich nur aus sich selbst ergibt. Und mehr oder weniger alles, was uns Menschen eben irgendwie gehört, ja nur eine Leihgabe der Erde ist. Deswegen würde ich durchaus sehr kritisch auch auf den Eigentumsbegriff schauen und gerade im Zusammenhang mit dem Kolonialismus natürlich auch einen sehr kritischen Blick darauf werfen, wenn in vergangenen Jahrhunderten anderen etwas weggenommen wurde und es jetzt heutzutage als das Eigentum geclaimed wird. Zum Kolonialismus und der Geschichte Afrikas habe ich ehrlich gesagt leider nicht so viel Wissen. Wir hatten das in der 8. oder 9. Klasse kurz als Thema behandelt. Leider konnte ich aber auch mein Wissen dahingehend nie wirklich vertiefen und es ist auch ehrlich gesagt nie wieder in meiner schulischen oder auch in meiner studentischen Laufbahn zur Sprache gekommen. Vor allem im Studium haben wir überhaupt nichts über Kolonialismus lernen dürfen, was ich sehr kritisch finde, da der Kolonialismus und die Sklaverei und das Unrecht, was man ja auch in den Rechtswissenschaften behandelt, ja sehr eng verwoben ist. Daher ist mein Wissen da leider sehr begrenzt. Und ich würde sagen, dass es eher eine untergeordnete Rolle gespielt hat in meinem Leben und auch in meinem schulischen und meinem studentischen. Ich würde mir aber wünschen, dass es ein viel stärkeres, präsenteres Thema wird und auch in der Schule und jüngeren Kindern, dass sie viel näher an die Materie herangeführt werden, wie es ja beispielsweise auch mit der NS-Vergangenheit in Deutschland sehr gut aufgearbeitet wird und sehr, sehr präsent ist. So finde ich, sollte man auch mit dem Kolonialismus umgehen. Ich finde, dass es einen viel größeren Gerechtigkeitsausgleich für die Opfer des Kolonialismus vor allem auch heute noch geben sollte. Ich glaube, da ist wenig Aufarbeitungsarbeit in Deutschland geleistet worden und ich finde, für eine gerechtere Welt sollte man definitiv da beispielsweise Erinnerungskultur schaffen und Erinnerungstage oder auch eine viel höhere Präsenz allein in den Schulen und an den Universitäten dafür schaffen. Gerade insbesondere was Raubgüter betrifft, in Museen, beispielsweise Kunstwerke oder Gemälde oder andere Dinge, die durch den Kolonialismus geraubt wurden, sollten viel stärker gekennzeichnet werden als Raubkunst oder als Raubgut des Kolonialismus. Ich finde, auch da gibt es viel zu wenig Aufmerksamkeit auf ganz viele kleine Dinge, die jeder in seinem Alltag kennt, die durch die Kolonialisierung sozusagen nach Europa gekommen sind. Und für einen Gerechtigkeitsausgleich muss man das kenntlich machen. Das kann man auch durch eben Erinnerungskultur schaffen, wie Feiertage oder einfach Erinnerungstage an die Opfer des Kolonialismus, wie man es ja auch mit der NS-Geschichte in Deutschland macht. Und man sollte vielleicht auch deutlich kritischer mit historischen Persönlichkeiten umgehen, wie Bismarck, die ja einen elementaren Teil zur Kolonialisierung beigetragen haben und die vielleicht deutlich kritischer beurteilen und sie nicht als die großen Helden der Sozialversicherung zum Beispiel darstellen. Denn ja, das ist auch ein Teil, den sie zur Geschichte beigetragen haben. Aber das ist eben auch nur oft gelungen, weil anderen was weggenommen wurde. Und das ist, finde ich, sehr wichtig, das zu kennzeichnen. Ich glaube, dass die Geschichte eine ganz, ganz elementare Rolle auch heutzutage spielt. Aus der Geschichte sollte man immer lernen. Und ich glaube, Deutschland ist da vielleicht ein relativ gutes Vorbild, was die NS-Vergangenheit betrifft. Ich glaube, da konnte und durfte das Land ganz, ganz viel dazulernen und keine Wiedergutmachung, aber durch die Erinnerungskultur, die wir geschaffen haben, sorgen wir vielleicht auch in Zukunft dafür, dass solch ein Schreckensgeschehen nie wieder passieren wird. Und das Gleiche ist, glaube ich, erstrebenswert mit dem Kolonialismus. Da sollte doch deutlich mehr Transparenz erfolgen, wo, wann, wie geraubt wurde beispielsweise oder wann kolonialisiert wurde, wie die Menschen unter der Sklaverei gelitten haben. Da sollte es eine deutlich größere Transparenz geben. Ich glaube, die wirtschaftlichen und politischen Beziehungen zwischen Europa und Afrika sind ganz stark geprägt von der Kolonialisierung. Das sieht man eben zum einen an der Unterrepräsentation des globalen Südens, gerade in großen Nichtregierungsorganisationen oder auch in großen Weltorganisationen wie den United Nations ist der globale Süden oftmals stark unterrepräsentiert und das macht sich natürlich auch am politischen Weltgeschehen bemerkbar, denn wenn weniger Menschen aus diesen Regionen an den großen Tischen mitsitzen, dann können sie auch weniger für diese Region entscheiden und dementsprechend würde ich sagen, dass da ein sehr starker politischer Einfluss besteht. Das Gleiche gilt natürlich auch wirtschaftlich und auch wirtschaftlich gilt ja immer noch die Schlechterstellung des afrikanischen Kontinents beispielsweise gegenüber Europa und auch immer noch ein sehr, sehr großes Abhängigkeitsverhältnis, was man auch auf die Kolonialisierung zurückführt.
Now, reflecting on these two videos that we've watched from our two students from Humboldt University, two of the other reparative justice initiatives outline cultural preservation and continued advocacy. The absence of generational dialogue or intergenerational dialogue has resulted in a dimming down of history, if you may. History has now descended on the doorstep of Europe and the West, and it is likely to have consequences. The median age across Europe currently is around 43, and in Africa it sits at around 1920. Makmid, after reflecting on some of the comments that have been made by our two contributors, will it take another generation to face up to the past, or are we likely to see resistance being the main response coming back? Because I feel that they encompassed a good understanding of what colonial history means in terms of when we speak about the extractive nature of how it actually conducted itself. But do you think, in terms of the youth of today and the people who are currently the policymakers at the top, are we likely to see or continue to see more resistance coming back?
Absolutely. That is very obvious, and we should be prepared and expectant of it. The resistance is anchored on a number of factors: ignorance, a lack of education and understanding of why there needs to be a repair for those historical crimes, a deliberate ignorance. I'm using the word a lack of understanding and another phrase called that I'm using deliberate ignorance, because there are people who are deliberately ignorant of this issue because they're not trying to make the effort to learn and understand. They're blocking. And this is the reason for this in some cases is because the more they know, the more they realize and the more they acknowledge that, I'm a inheritor of something that is wrong. So that refusal to learn is a form of protection for certain people not to acknowledge, not to agree, and the fear of losing the privileges that they already have. So there will be resistance because people are not being taught. There's what we see now, or what a lot of people refer to as mis or disinformation, is not new. The misinformation, and disinformation and miseducation of generations is something that's been going on for centuries to ensure that the status quo is protected, the privileges that certain sections of society enjoy, they continue to enjoy. So they are given a portion of history, a portion of education that does not really open their minds to the realities of what is actually happening, what happened, and as a result, they're it's only half truth that they have, even if it's truth, and that prevents them from understanding and from engaging and realizing that the global equity that we are demanding for, the human dignity that we are demanding, is actually in their own interest as well. It is not just for Africans.
Please elaborate on that, because we actually had an informal conversation about it. Basically, the turnaround and the direct response or consequence of what it means for them to be vested in this process. Please take us through that.
Just if you quote from Rosalia, one of the people that was interviewed, one of the things that she mentioned was that they have not been talked about this. There was a brief mention of history and slavery and colonialism in primary school, nothing in high school, nothing at university level. And this was a law student, right? Studying and the issues of justice. Now, how do you expect somebody like that to engage in an issue that they have no idea about? Or they have been brought up and trained in a way that gives them a particular view of the world. So when these people hear that migrants are coming from Africa, the message that they get is, they're coming to steal from us. They're coming to take our resources. They're coming to deprive us of employment, employment opportunities. What they fail to realize is that these people and their ancestors they've been stolen. A lot of resources and opportunities that they were meant to inherit had already been stolen by their own forebears and forefathers and ancestors. So the wealth, the privileges that they're enjoying now, they are enjoying at the expense of these people who are coming from Africa who are now looking for greener pastures. And just going back to Yasmin's example of the man who came to the farm, right? Who found that this farm actually did not even belong to them. The realization came from the education, and that education came from the anthropological exhumation of the bodies, right? The bones that they found in that was a moment of learning for that particular man. Now, what you do with the learning that you've got is another question, what altogether. But it has to start first with education and the debunking of the miseducation that has been given to generations before and generations now. So that's why it will take time, because it's not just a matter of people reading this or hearing Makmid Kamara talking about reparative justice, talking about equity, that they will transform their minds. Because it's been centuries of lies, misinformation, miseducation. What we call fake news now is a historical and a colonial project. It is not something new. So generations in Europe have been given fake news about how Europe gained its wealth. That has to be reformed. That education, that has to be changed. And the issue of migration, going back to the point about how it will benefit everybody, it's very straightforward, perhaps. For some people who disagree, but it's very straightforward. Return what you have stolen and change the mechanics of how nations gain wealth, so that those nations who have been deprived for centuries will be able to take control of their resources, distribute these resources to their people, to the young generation. Africa is the future of the world. The 2/3 of the global workforce in the next 20 and 30 years will be Africans. By 2050, according to Mo Ibrahim Foundation, 2/3 of the global workforce will be African. This is not something, when we say Africa is the future, it's not a slogan. It is not...
it's a reality.
It is the reality. And until we acknowledge that reality, and one way for us to ensure that this future that we all want to see is something that is equitable, the resources that have been stolen have to be returned. The processes, the structures, the global structures and systems that were founded post-World Wars, right? Post-World War II, which were to maintain the power and status quo of the West, of the profiteers of colonialism and slavery, has to be transformed, has to be reformed, redesigned and repurposed to ensure that the new nations of the world, the emerging nations of the world, the global majority from which the wealth of the world was taken from, they have to get back that wealth in different shapes and forms. Decisions that are being made by people who sit at this level has to be decentralized. Africa has to be given, because sometimes we say we need to take control of our resources. But you will see the backlash now from when we're talking about the issue of land redistribution and land reform. You see how those who continue to profit are fighting back. Our challenge is to ensure that we are clear with what we want, we're clear with the demands, we are also not naive, that we will not just get it on a platter. We have to fight for it and retain and resist the backlash that will come. And once we're able to produce and provide for the young generation, a lot of people go through the deserts to migrate to Europe. It's because of the deprivation of the resources. I come from Sierra Leone, where when the war started, when the war was popular and everybody was talking about the war in Sierra Leone, what they refer Sierra Leone to was blood diamonds, right? We're known for producing diamonds, but the diamonds that we produce also fueled the war that killed over 50,000 people, right? And got thousands displaced and fled into as refugees, and lots of arms and limbs hacked by people who are still living there in abject poverty. Now, imagine if those resources, whether it's our diamonds or gold, were utilized by the people, for the people within nobody will want to leave Sierra Leone to go and live in squalor in Europe. And that will also create space for the young people like Rosalia and Julia, who may be worried about these migrants coming to take their jobs, because there will be no migrants going there to take their jobs. If I have my resources and my wealth and have access to the things that I need, the essential things that I need, electricity, water, education, food, why would I leave that to go and live in squalor in Europe? Because a lot of our brothers and sisters who go there, who think they're going for greener pastures, are actually living in squalor. We see this. We see them, we experience it, we feel it. And as a result, they're desperate. There are few, of course, lots of people who are making and changing their lifestyles, and people see that. But there are all others, so that story also has to be told. That it's not all honky-dory out there. Yeah. And the young white Europeans who are whether they're voting for right-wing parties now to stay in power because they are afraid that migrants will come and take their job, is because they've been miseducated for centuries. They lack the understanding of how the equity that we're demanding is actually in their interest, because these people will stay in their country and have access to the resources that companies that are based in their country are coming to steal from the Africans.
Mm. Yasmin, I think on that note, I would like you to maybe touch on something that Makmid mentions here around, if the wealth was brought back, then, our youth would not have this mass exodus out of Africa going to Europe for greener pastures. But wouldn't one then argue, especially as we think about perceptions, that our governments already are, well, most of them democratically elected, and they are there to serve the people. But, we bring back this word corruption. And again, it will be, if you seek reparations and our governments are the custodians of seeing this process through, what trust is there that things will be done properly, especially because we still see some ills being perpetuated through our governments? So one then would argue, we speak of reparations, but, functionally, also structurally within our own governments, there are challenges.
It comes down to a question of accountability. And the rebuilding of trust is going to require, I think, that our governments are able to change this question of perception. And perception that they themselves, in my country, in South Africa, that in our country, that when you speak about reparations, the first question that comes up is, well, how can we trust them to deal with money that is going to be set aside for reparations? And I think that in many ways, it's also it's a challenge, and it's one that we need to overcome. The other is also, I think, a recognition by citizens that, in fact, the global world in which our governments operate is uniquely unfair, and that in many ways it's weighted against them taking on transformative positions, including transformative policies. And once they begin to take those steps in those directions, then you do see that world opinion becomes weighted against them, and that is when the campaign of disinformation and misinformation begins. And a primary example of that is, of course, the question of transformation in South Africa. And two issues. I think South Africa is waiting with bated breath to see the encounter between the South African delegation, who is on a work visit to the United States.
Not an official visit.
It's a work visit. And this is to meet with President Trump, who persists, I think, with a number of claims. The one thing that Afrikaners are facing persecution in our country and that their land is being taken away. And notice the use of the word persecution, which is a legal term when you define a crime against humanity. And certainly, I mean, Afrikaners is a race group and not targeted. And neither is their land being taken away from them. And not one of the people in that delegation can say that their land has been taken away from them either through expropriation or any other means. The second is that our black economic equity laws are unfavorable to white people. And yet when you look at the ramifications of who owns South Africa at this point in time, 5% of it is in the hands of, at least 85% of it is in the hands of 5% of the population. And when you look at the top echelons of who, controls our economy, those are still people who are of white race. So these misperceptions exist, but nevertheless, they are at the heart of what is going to be. I mean, all of us are fearing that our president shouldn't be humiliated by a man like Elon Musk sitting, a South African mind, you sitting at the right hand of President Trump and say, tell us, are you going to allow him to come into South Africa without having to comply with BEE? Yes or no, because that's the way in which President Trump, who's very transactional, is probably going to respond. And the fact that it needed white Afrikaner capital to go to America and create this opportunity for a meeting is quite telling. So there's a need, I think, for us also to begin to ensure that our governments also have the support they need to deal with transformation in our country. And that's also the job of all of us, because you can't leave it to the state alone, because these are structural questions. And while government is responsible for dismantling the structural questions, to enable them to do it, they need support. And I think that often we are critical, but that criticism also needs to come with constructive ways in which we can support them. At the same time, I think it's important for us to be able to tell our governments that you can't act in a particular way. Give you an example. I think we heard about the story of what happened in Namibia, during the sort of German, what I would call occupation of Namibia. And what many people don't know, that this is, the first genocide of the century there. And that actually happened, I would say it was the theater place for the Holocaust to take place afterwards. And there you read accounts from, the general who was in charge of the army, how he chased the Ovambo and Herero people through the desert like animals, and the way in which they were rounded up and kept in what I would call concentration camps. And that, the predecessor to Mengele was in fact, the professor for Mengele, where they conducted these experiments on Herero and Ovambo women. But do young German students learn about that? They don't. And do us Africans teach that lesson? And should the Namibian government be deciding for the Herero and Ovambo people that development aid is enough and that reparations per se, which are a legal obligation, should be paid? I think these are the questions which our governments also have to confront, that they make compromises. And you see those compromises with structural adjustment programs. You see that with the way in which they deal with the questions of debt. And so these are also political questions of accountability, which we as citizens actually need to ask our governments. And that's certainly the case for South Africa. We all wonder, what are we going to give away? And that's, I think, a real question that all of us have to ask when we talk about reparative justice, but certainly what I would call transformative justice, which deals with the dismantling of the structural underpinnings of oppression. It took a case, more than 30 years in South Africa. 2 weeks ago, a judge sitting in one of the political crimes cases of the past, the COSAS 4, delivered the first judgment on apartheid being a crime against humanity. The first time this was tested, not just in the world, but in South Africa as well, and setting out what the fundamental basis is for calling apartheid a crime against humanity, going beyond the question of a convention and customary law, but actually entrenching it and finding a place in South African law for that. And that's a very important step forward. But why did it take so many years? The United Nations, I think, declared apartheid a crime against humanity in 1977, and this is 2025.
Yeah, very telling, as you say, in terms of the timeline and the realization in terms of coming to where we are now. As the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, the very essence in our name is that we advocate for freedom. Reparative justice as a path to freedom in changing the world order, as you've been speaking to, Yasmin, towards equity and fundamentally a matter of human right. Your final words, please, Makmid. I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. This has been an enlightening conversation. And by way of final words, I will say there are no final words on reparative justice, because the campaign continues and the advocacy continues. So I want to firstly use the opportunity to encourage our listeners and viewers out there that if you haven't developed any interest on why we are now asking for repair, we are now asking for equity and dignity, please take some time to educate yourself. Take your time to perhaps listen to this and watch these podcasts and educate yourself so that you can educate someone else. For the civil society organizations, government, and others who have been advocating, the campaign will not end just by the end of the declaration of this year, like it's the theme of the year. In fact, what we are asking for is that the theme of the year becomes a theme of the decade. And we have the UN Permanent Forum for People of African Descent who've asked for and have gotten an extension of the decade at the UN level. Within AU, I think the conversation is going on. And reparative justice education should be a matter of a personal objective and obligation for us all to keep learning and unlearning the various ways that we can continue to call for reparative justice, to call for accountability, to call for transformation of systems and reform of systems and structures to ensure that the African or the person of African descent receives and gets what they truly deserve. It is not a plea, it's not a campaign for charity, it is a campaign for justice.
Yasmin, thank you, Makmid. Yasmin, your final thoughts, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this. You used the word freedom, and I think in our conversation we talked about human dignity. And, Ubuntu which is just not a South African concept. It's really rooted in African culture, the notion that we are not individuals, but that we are all part of communities. And that, in fact, to be human is to recognize the dignity and the humanity of the other. And that's enshrined in the South African Constitution and really guides this question of what freedom and equality and human dignity mean. But of course, matching that with reality is really, I think, the task for all of us. And that's where I would say that in, the sort of famous lexicon that we use, a luta continua, that this is a struggle for justice and accountability for all of us. But it's also for the liberation, not just of victims, but for the liberation of perpetrators as well, so that we all recognize that if we deal with these structural injustices, that we can find the humanity in each other. And that's this meaning, I think, of the word interconnected, which I think is what Ubuntu is also about, that we cannot be without the other. And that should be the recognition as we go forward in this next decade, that for all of us to live with human dignity and freedom, we need each other. But that's a recognition too, and an acknowledgement of the fact that in order to do that, we also need to be conscious of the fact that we benefited, that we have privilege, and that we cannot continue to enjoy the privilege without the consciousness of what it has meant for the other.
And I think on that note, we will definitely leave it. As we talk about global equity versus or with human dignity, talking about the issue of the legal ramifications versus the morality of the question, it is definitely a conversation that needs to continue. And I think as we continue to engage the youth and also those who are making the considerations, it really is at a priority level now. It's gone beyond the rhetoric. We held a roundtable speaking about from rhetoric to the actual moving ahead and what does implementation actually look like, but maybe also addressing the issue of cooperation and what are the varying avenues which can be used for reparative justice. But at the core and fundamental of it is really to seek justice for people who have been wronged in the past. And on that note, I think we leave you with your final reflections as our viewers to see you have the information, you have the knowledge now, and I think it's really up to you to make your mind up. My right, your right, our right. Humanity will and continues always to be for us all. This has been the first episode of Season 5 of Let's Talk Human Rights, the vodcast, the FNF Africa platform exploring various human rights issues. If you are interested in any of our activities, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and X. Simply check for FNF Africa. See you in our next episode. Till then, goodbye.